So hello everyone and welcome to the new CSS Grid series by Anti-Gravity. And in this series we'll discuss in depth about what is CSS Grid, how are they used in a web page, and we will design some basic and some pretty advanced layouts using CSS Grids only. So first of all, let us discuss about the basics of CSS Grid. So hold your breaths and let's learn about CSS Grid. So first of all, you have to learn about basically what is a grid. So you, basically a grid is nothing but when a few set of rows, when a few set of horizontal lines and a few set of vertical lines intersect each other, it forms a grid. Doesn't it resembles like something? Yes, you understood is right. It is your MS Excel's, you can say workbook. You can see here. Here a few vertical lines and a few horizontal lines are striking each other like this, and this forms a grid system. So now you must have understood that you use this grid in your daily lives. And whenever a few horizontal lines, a pair of horizontal lines travel, they form a row. The area between two horizontal lines is known as a row. So in this MS Excel sheet, this 1 is a row, 2 is a row, 3 is a row, 4 is a row, 5 is a row, and so on. And the distance between and the area between two vertical lines is known as a column. So here BM, BL, BN and so on are the columns of this Excel workbook. So I think that you might have understood what is a grid. So a grid is basically a system of rows and columns. This is a row, this is a row, this is a row, this is a column, this is a column, this is a column. So when few set of columns and a few set of rows is known as the grid. Basically when a few set of horizontal and a few set of vertical lines intersect each other, they form a grid. So I think it is clear now. Let's move on. Now we will understand what are CSS grids. So now you all have understood what are grids. Now it's our turn to understand what are CSS grid. Let's move on to the boring definition now. In CSS, grid layout creates complex responsive design grid layouts more easily and consistently across browser. So it is a bit tough definition. So first of all, I will make you understand what does this definition means. So basically it means that using CSS Grid, we can create complex, responsive web design layouts very easily. To make you understand, suppose this is a web page. I want the web page to look like this in a desktop, like this in a tablet, and like this in a mobile. Without using CSS Grid, it would be quite a difficult task. But this is why CSS Grid has been invented to make our task easier. So I will show you the practical use now. Suppose this is her website and I want it, let's say if I reduce my width here, I am reducing my width and you can see now it has changed. First you can see the sidebar was like this, the ads were like this. As soon as I doing that, sidebar is going down and the ads are going at the bottom. And when I'm more reducing, it all is one above the another. So I hope that you have understood about the practical use of CSS Grid. There's also a use of CSS Grid. You can see that this is a real website, and with the use of CSS Grid, you can see it's looking like this. But as soon as I make it size smaller, you can see it's like this, and more smaller, it's like this. So basically, this is the use of CSS Grid to make our web page responsive across different browsers and responsive across different devices. So let's move on. Let's define some terms regarding CSS grid. First of all, we'll discuss what are grid lines. I will show you here. You can see that in a grid, the lines, you can see this line, this line, this line, this line, this line. So I told you at the beginning, a set of horizontal and a set of vertical lines, when they intersect each other, they form a grid. So those vertical lines, those horizontal lines individually, they are known as the CSS grid lines. So I hope you've understood. Uh, so in this example, this is a grid line, this is a grid line, this is also a grid line. So I hope you have understood what are CSS grid lines. So the vertical and horizontal lines that divide the grid and separate the columns and rows. I have also told you what are rows and what are columns. The space, the area between two vertical lines is known as a column. The area between two horizontal lines is known as a row. Have you understood? Yes, I think that you understood. To recap it, I will explain you once again. The lines that form a grid, the lines that divide that separate the columns and the rows are basically what are known as the grid lines. And the area between two horizontal line is a row. The area between two vertical lines is a column. Now, what a grid says. So, whenever a pair of column a pair of sorry a pair of vertical lines and a pair of horizontal lines strike each other, so it's basically when a column and a row strike each other, they form a closed figure. This closed figure is known as grid cell. So a single unit of a CSS grid. So these grid cells basically form a CSS grid. So this is a cell, this is a cell. You can see that one cell, two cell, three cell, four cell, five cell, and n number of cells form a CSS grid. I hope you have understood the terminologies. Now it's time for us to move to the code. So let's learn how to make our very own CSS grids now. But before doing that, let us first understand how let us first understand the structure of this particular CSS grid. So to understand the structure of this particular CSS grid, you have to click on the inspect element of your browser, and then you have to click on this grid. Now you can see that it has formed a few rows and a few columns. You can see that this the first row, this is the second row, third row, fourth row, fifth row, and sixth row. So there are six rows in total, and one, two, and three columns. So six row and three columns. So overall there are 18 blocks, 18 grid cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. In this particular grid, there are 18 grid cells, 3 columns, and 6 rows. And now we will learn how to make this particular grid in this video, and in the next videos we will learn how to make this responsive. So in the next few videos we will learn how to change the grid as the size of the viewport decreases. Let's start now. So I am opening my VS Code here, and also I will just click on go live. Now you can see that. Now first of all I will make a container element which will act as the grid, and I will just add 7 child elements of it. Now there are 7 child elements, and what were the name of the child elements? You can see that here the names were header, navigation, header, navigation. So now basically there will be 6 child elements. I mistakenly wrote that as 7. So here are 6 child elements: one header, one navigation, one sidebar, one main, and one add and one footer. You can see that here. Now in my CSS file, let's start how to style and make a grid only. So I will just style my container element, and in my container element I will give it a background color of, let's say, red, and I will also give it a height of 900 pixels and a height of 500 pixels, width of 900 pixels, sorry, and also I will give my items a background color of green, let's say, and also I will give my each items a width of 100 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. You can see that now my each element has a width of 100 pixels and a height of 50 pixels. So now we'll basically make our container a grid element. So like to make a container a flex box, we write display is equal to flex, and similarly to make a container a grid, we write display is equal to grid. So this is a grid element, and you can see that as soon as I added the display grid, it has even spacing around it. If I inspect my element and you can just click on this grid, you can see that it has by default made 1 2 3 4 5 6 rows for my 6 child elements, and 6 rows for my 6 child elements and one column only. So now we'll just learn how to arrange this, not in a line but using different patterns. First you will learn how to arrange them in a 3 into 3 layout. In the 3 into 2 layout, sorry. So 3 in this row and 3 in another row. So basically 2 rows and 3 columns. To just to describe the rows and the columns in a grid, we write here grid template columns for rows and grid template rows for our rows. Let's say I want, as I told you, I want 3 columns. So let's say my columns with 100 pixels, 100 pixels and 100 pixels. Let's increase it to 200 pixels, 200 pixels and 200 pixels, because 100 is quite small, and I want 2 rows of, let's say, 200 pixels only and 200 pixels only. Now you can see that now my blocks are seen. These are my blocks 1 2 3 and 1 2 3 as I described you. And if I want 2 on each row, I can just increase the amount of rows and decrease the amount of columns. Now you can see it is arranged now in a 2 into 3 layout. 2 here, 2 here and 2 here. So as you may have understood that the grid template columns is used to describe the width of each column that we want to use, and the grid template rows is used to describe the height of each row that we want to use. So there is a unit in CSS Grid known as FR. So FR is nothing but a fraction. If I write here the width of our column, the height of the width of a column as 1 FR, 1 FR, so I am telling my grid to just evenly share the volume between my two columns. So 1 FR literally means a fraction. So let's say I have 3 elements and I have a total width of 150 pixels. So writing 1 FR, 1 FR and 1 FR for each, I am just telling my browser to just give each element the equal width of if I have 150 pixels width in total, so each element width should be 50 pixels. No elements width should be more and no element width should be less. So writing 1 FR, 1 FR, I am just telling my browser to just make columns of equal width. So let me show you that. If I just show my browsers, like if I just show my grid like this, you can see that all my grid cells, all my rows have equal width. So this is my row, this is equal width to this width. So each column has equal width and each row has a width of 200 pixels. So 200 pixels here, 200 pixels here and 200 pixels here. Have you understood? I think you would have. So basically you would think that if I want to make, let's say, 12 columns of 1 FR each, I would have to write 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR and so on. And it will be a, you can say, lengthy process. To avoid this, CSS has made a function known as repeat. So basically what the repeat function does, it takes 2 arguments. The first argument tells it to basically how many times to repeat this function. So let's say if I write 6 and 1 FR, so this means that I want 6 columns whose width should be 1 FR each. If I write here 3 columns, I want 3 columns of width 1 FR each. If I write 3 comma 100 pixels, I want 3 columns of 100 pixels each. So this is a very good function if we have to make a large amount of rows. Let's say if I want to make 13 rows, if I want to make 113 rows, basically you would never make this amount of rows, but then also this function provides us with good facility. So now you have understood what does the repeat function does. what does the FR unit does. Now we'll learn about the gap. So gap, if I just write gap 10 pixels, did you notice anything? I will again come and comment. You can see that. As soon as I added gap, these items and these items, space in between them increased. Basically what the gap does, it in between two cells, it just gives you can say a margin. So this is my first and this is my second cell, so it will give a 10 pixels margin between each cell element. Let's say my element it adds, so if I give a gap element of 10 pixels to my ads, so it will give a 10 pixels gap from main, a 10 pixels gap from footer, a 10 pixels gap from navigation. This is basically our gap. So I hope you understood, and this gap function works in all the four corners. So to specify mainly the two corners, I will write row gap, and let's say 10 pixel. So whenever I write row gaps, it will give gaps in between the rows. So this is our first row, this is our second row, and in between these rows it will give a gap of 10 pixels. If I want a gap between columns, I will write column gap, and column gap will give space between columns. This is our first column, this is our second column, and this is our third column, and in between these two columns and these two columns there is a space of 10 pixels. So I hope you understood this. So let's just give it a gap of 10 pixels. So now you have understood the basics of the CSS grid system, and now you can design a very basic layout using CSS grid. And now we will learn how to design this layout. So, and in between it I will tell you some new more functions and some new more methods. So let's first design our header element. So you can see that if I just open my grid here, if I just, you can see that here my header element is taking all the three columns. How is it possible? We have learned that a single element can take only a single cell, but here header is taking three columns, navigation is also taking three columns, sidebar is taking three rows. How is it possible? Yes, it is possible. So I will tell you how is it possible. So first of all, let me give my header element and class of header, and in my dot header style, I just write a property grid column start of 1 and grid column end of 4. Now you would see the magic here. The header element will now start at the first column and end at the third column. Now why is it showing? Because we have specified the width of each item. Now as soon as I remove this width element, you could see that as soon as I remove this width attribute, sorry, the width property of this items, you could see that my header element's width has risen to this much, because I have given a property of grid column start of 1 and grid column end of 4, because this means that start my header at the first row and end it before the fourth column. Start my header element from the first column and end it before the fourth column. See that it starts from the first column and ends before the fourth column. So basically it starts from the first grid line and ends at the fourth grid line. So it's very clear, and we can also mention this property for rows also. I will show you how to mention it for rows. If I wrote at grid row start of 1 and grid row end of 4, it will start at the first row and end at the third row. Basically it will start from the first grid line and end at the fourth grid line. I think it's very clear. But there's also a shorthand for this property. It's known as grid column for columns and grid row for rows. So for column, let's say I want it to start at the first grid line and end at the fourth grid line. So I separate this with a forward slash, and I want it to start at the first row and end at the fourth row, at the third row only. So I separate this using a forward slash. There's also a property called span. So basically I'm telling to start my grid column at the first grid line and let it span two grid lines more. So if I wrote it at 2, it meant that start it at the first grid line and end it before the first grid line. But if I'm writing span 2, it means that start it at the first grid line and let the element span two more grid lines. So what I'm basically telling it to start at the first line and span two more. So I'm basically telling it to, if it is this element, I want it to start at this and span one and two grid lines more. So this is the first grid line and this is the second grid line. I'm telling it to span this grid line and this grid line more using the span. Okay, so I think this video is now very long, so I'll teach you how to make this type of layout in the next video. Till then, stay tuned and subscribe us. Thank you for watching this video.